Wilson. Maybe Wilson was on your hand again, too. Hey, Joe.
I'm going to see. I never left you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the last CACR speaker series for the term here. We're finishing off strong today with Bryan Sacks, the CISO for the state of Indiana. A few quick reminders before I introduce Bryan and his talk. One is if you haven't already, the attendance sheet will be going around. So if you wouldn't mind, please do sign up for that. And then I'll mention this at the end as well, but the next event to keep in mind for this purpose is January 30th, which is, I know, the far distant future, but it's going to be a cool one. That's Bruce Schneier's talk, right? He's giving the Ostrom lecture on cybersecurity for us. That's going to be in Wittenberger Auditorium because it'll be a slightly bigger audience that we're thinking for that one. Nothing against you, Brian. If they only knew what they were in store for, this would be
Could have made it better.
Yeah. No, I like the title. I think it's good. So without further ado then, so guys, Bryan Sacks is the CISO, as I said, for the state of Indiana. In that role, he's responsible for establishing the vision and strategy of the state's cybersecurity efforts. His areas of responsibility include the Indiana ISAC, which was stood up, just 4 or 5 years ago now, and is continuing to evolve, as well as the state's SOC, Security Operations Center, and the Security Operations and Engineering Risk and Compliance teams. So in other words, you got your hands full. To say nothing of the other two little adorable responsibilities that we talked about earlier. So today, Bryan's going to be talking to us a little bit about the realities, frankly, of being a CISO in the state of Indiana. Which is going to be, I think, really exciting. We'll have plenty of time for discussion as well, so we can take this in a lot of different directions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bryan to the... Thanks so much for being here. Yeah. Well, I should say you're an IU alum as well. I should have said that.
Yeah. So thanks, Dr. Shackford. Thanks, Vaughn. I was going to call you Von Miller. I'm not sure why. I don't know if you're like a Denver Bronco or something. So before we get started, a couple things. I want to talk about some of the partnerships that we have. So obviously with IU, we have a significant investment in the data center. So if you haven't been over there, I'm not sure you're allowed to do tours, but it's a really cool facility. Highly recommend doing that.
You just got to know that.
Just got to know that, that's right. As Dr. Shackford said, we do have some partnerships with other universities as well. Up at Purdue is where our NISAC is, or our Security Operations Center. We actually do have about 15 students that go in and out on a part-time status and work some of the security events for us. We do have shift leads that are state employees, but we also have that as well. This year, we actually did something new with Ivy Works, so Indie Women in Tech program. So Salesforce actually provided some dollars out for folks to have paid internships, so we participated in that program as well. And then about 2 years ago, we started a new fellowship program. I think you guys have a fellowship program as well here, where we hire about 3 to 5 students. So juniors, seniors, and graduate students, all with different pay ranges, $12, $15, $17 an hour. That's worked out really well for the students because they kind of get into the junior security engineer roles right off the bat versus maybe an internship where you're not getting as much hands-on. So it's a little longer in duration, but it's 3 to 6 months in time. And then we partnered last year on the capstone?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I think it was just April.
Okay. Yeah. So a really cool capstone project. We did a GDPR assessment for the state. Not that we necessarily have to meet that regulation right now, but we're all about being proactive in that space. And so we actually made some changes in our information systems inventory to add some fields on, hey, what data should we collecting on some of the different systems. So really cool there.
That's great. Yeah, we focus on California's new privacy law there too.
Yep,
so, yeah,
exactly. And actually, we hired someone out of that presentation group to do our fellowship.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, with Tim Brooks there. So really cool stuff, really valued partnership. So thanks again for having me. One other announcement. So I am MSIS 11, and I actually just did a blog for the Kelly School. So you can check that out on my LinkedIn, or you can go to msisblog.kelly.iu.edu. All right. So it's not me, it's you. It's an interesting title. Has anyone ever had a breakup? It's trying to relate it to people, right? So it's usually the other way around. It's me, not you. People are personable. They don't want to kind of hurt the other's feelings. Well, in the boardroom, it's not really like that, right? It's actually you. And so that's what this session is all about. So I've never actually given this presentation. A lot of the slides are new, so bear with me. I have a little bit of an outline here. I usually do presentations that are 10 to 30 minutes. So 60 minutes was like, okay, I better write some stuff down. That's a really long time. So I mainly say that to help manage your expectations, maybe lower your expectations, which is really what kind of the boardroom's all about too, right? You have to manage expectations for senior leadership. And the CISO role is becoming a lot more intrinsic to a business-centric position versus those technical capabilities. And so it's more about program management versus kind of flipping that switch on, let's say, a firewall. So I have some slides to briefly cover public sector versus private sector, some of the differences between those. Have some slides regarding metrics, KPIs, some ways to utilize a framework and how it's related for some of your cybersecurity programs, how to mature that program over time, and then some non-academic things maybe that you wouldn't learn here that I'm willing to share from my personal experience. All right, so drum roll. To me, the board says it's the best, and that's coming from a CISO. Like I said, it's often because a board is not always going to understand IT risk. They might understand business risk, they might understand reputational risk, but it's the CISO's job to actually translate that IT risk into a business risk. Right, so they need to be educated a lot of the time. And then, like I said earlier, you need to kind of manage that expectation. And so I've done a poor job in certain instances in the past, and I'm going to share an example of that. So a couple of years ago, I got approved to buy some new firewall equipment. I got approved to buy an IPS system, managed switches, wireless access points, all new, right? But I didn't necessarily consider some of the operational aspects from that senior leadership perspective. I wasn't really aligned to some of the customer SLAs that, 5.9 capability on the network. So I'll pause there because it probably seems like that was a state. It really wasn't a state, because if it was a state, I probably would have gotten fired for doing stuff like that. But it's really at home. So my wife approved all these things. She was my senior leadership, and my kids were kind of the customer in this instance, right? So they wanted that 5.9 availability. They have to have their Disney shows, right? Yeah, that's, you don't want to mess that up. So what ended up happening is I wasn't aligned, and I wasn't able to kind of produce the end result of security, right? I had to pull a lot of things back because I was causing maybe a network outage. I actually got locked out of my own system at one point because like I said, I'm not as technical. It's something that I wanted to learn, but I had a PFSense box, and you actually have to set up your own DHCP servers for that, and I kind of forgot about that, so I actually couldn't get an IP on my own network. So I actually removed some of that equipment and got something else that was a little bit easier to configure. Part of that was automated, and I was actually able to reset some of the expectations, right? And that's kind of what the board's all about too, is you have to consider the business, you have to consider the operations. And so what I ended up with was a lot of routers have like a guest network capability, but I had an entertainment network where all this has microsegmentation, all has virtual VLANs. Kids' devices were on a separate network as well. And then, as you know, Internet of Things can be pretty risky. So I actually put that off on a completely separate network. And if you steal like a Ring doorbell, I've heard you can actually pull the SSID and password in some instances off that. So completely separate that. And those are the security initiatives at home that I wanted to do. And that allowed me to actually add additional security measures once it was operational, right? I had no big impact at the home network. And then I was able to introduce like internet filtering. So blocking specific categories of sites for my house could have really helped my bank account if I blocked shopping, but I wasn't able to do that. And then you can even introduce a lot of new security measures over time. And so, for example, there's a policy orchestrator where if I want my kid's device to turn off Wi-Fi at 8 p.m., I actually have to sign that policy that's specific to the device. So I'm definitely glad I learned this at home. But yeah, the end user, customer, senior leadership often dictate those needs, and so you need to kind of fit that in with both balancing security and operations. I thought I'd go through what is a CISO anyway, because there's probably a million different definitions for it. This is actually probably the first one that I found, mainly because I really want to read some components of what CISOs actually feel like. I'm actually going to read some of that to you, but The CISO is an executive level manager who directs strategy, operations, and the budget for the protection of enterprise information assets. Sounds pretty easy, but I really want to go through this, because I think it's pretty interesting. So it's kind of long. I actually highlighted some things, so I'll just read it. But basically, this is a fictional job posting, but it's from a former CSO of the state of Michigan, and he's the current CSO of a private sector company now that does security awareness training. So he says, wanted, an experienced, industry-leading chief information security officer at well below what the market is paying when considering both wages and benefits. But he's probably coming from the public sector view of the state of Michigan. This hacker guru who excels at stopping nation states and organized criminals from penetrating vulnerable mission-critical networks, the lead team of security staff who struggle in the fight against global adversaries and cyber war. This recognized expert in executive leadership, project management, team building, relationship management, and budgeting will have a minimum of 10 years of professional experience, 20 or 30 years preferred, manage complex security operations center, supervising large teams, although the team you actually manage is rather small, and recovering from global cyber attacks that have devastated international business operations. This exceptional individual will be able to mentor staff, build award-winning strategic and tactical plans, understand the complexities involved with global banking, stop cybercrime, and speak effectively in front of large internal and external audiences in funny, compelling, and industry thought-leading ways. Note, obtaining executive buy-in and speaking to media contacts, college interns, and the local PTA is a must. Expect plenty of after-hours meetings and numerous formal or informational dinners and lunches and breakfasts too, and know your spouse or family members are not invited. The CISO will coordinate, develop, and implement corporate policies such as information security, privacy, urban data management, and whatever policies are needed for compliance, including but not limited to HIPAA, PCI, IRS, ISO, NIST. These policies will be based on best practices globally, understanding of all local, national, international laws that pertain to data security, industrial control systems, Internet of Things. We expect this brilliant individual to keep up with relevant, emerging cyber startups in areas such as AI, quantum computing, 5G, digital assets like crypto, and other cool stuff. Required professional certifications include CISP, CISM, ISMB, CSSLD, CISO, CRISC, and a master's degree in computer science. Pretty tough. So most important of all is what I was getting to. The search committee expects this new CISO to ensure in writing that, in all caps, no data breaches will ever occur on your watch. Any ransomware attack or phishing attack that is successful against any of our company staff or contractors for the bad actors and against our organization will be considered an unacceptable security incident for the purposes of your limited term legal agreement. Note this one-sided contract shall be signed off on the first day of work. So he admits that he kind of goes slightly overboard, right? But there is a lot of truth in some of what he's saying, and that's kind of why I wanted to read it. A lot of CISOs feel that way right now, and part of it's what I said before. They're not really managing the expectations. So when you start to build a program, you start to recognize the gaps, and then there's no funding, then you have a disconnect. You have to say, okay, well, here's the risk on the table, and there's enough residual risk if we can't afford some of these investments. So we really do need to level set those expectations and then continuously present risks as much as possible. All right. Okay. So I did some Gartner research as well. What are the expectations from the for the CISO from the board of the CIO? So this is really about what the CIO expects from the CISO. But in the article, it's pretty interesting because the board actually expects a lot of similar things from the CIO. So when you look at these 6 things, strong vision. So if you relate that to cybersecurity, you're talking about the technologies, you're talking about the threats that are occurring and how to overcome them in a vision. And then your clear program, that's establishing some of the goals. That's establishing more of the tactical plan, the roadmap of how to achieve that vision. Obviously, you have to outline the costs. You're going to have some ROI, whether that's project-related, program-related. You definitely want to be able to measure some value. And then collaboration and communication skills. So a lot of times you need to be able to talk down to analyst level, engineer level, but all the way up to business executives, in my case, some agency heads, cross-department. You really need to talk to everyone and have them understand, so you have to know your audience. And then operational awareness and focus. A lot of times this is a forgotten one. Security really can't be done in a silo, right? You have to be able to work with operations. And operations is going to have their own roadmap. They're all about availability, right? And security is kind of not that. And so how do you balance between the two, but fit in with their roadmap? And that's kind of a key distinction. And then the challenging area, of course, is metrics. It's pretty easy to generate a lot of metrics. It's hard to generate meaningful metrics and ones that relate to who you're trying to present to or how you're trying to further the program. So we talked a lot about, so if you notice these 6 things, all about business, really. But this is a CISO, right? Shouldn't they be technical? Shouldn't they have technical components? Yes and no. To me, what I think you need to know in terms of being a CISO is not, you don't need to know how to like turn the knob, but you need to know the knob can be turned. So maybe said another way, you don't need to know how exactly to implement a capability, but that you have that capability in your toolbox, and then you know when to actually use it. So for example, if I have a car has thousands of parts, right? I don't need to know how all those parts work together. I just need to know that that car is going to get me from A to B, and I know how to drive that car. In business, think of something like conditional access. Anyone know what conditional access is? So it's kind of a new feature set from Microsoft where you actually have to meet a set of conditions in order to get access to a resource. So let's say I'm storing personal information on a SharePoint site, and I don't want everyone to be able to reach that. Sure, I can have some access control. What about device control, or where I'm actually looking that data from? So if I want this machine, State of Indiana network, I want this machine to be able to access it, but I don't want my home network or my Mac at home to be able to access that same resource. That's a conditional access policy, right? I don't need to know exactly how to flip the switch, but I need to know that the capability is there so I can protect my assets as best as I can. Another advantage of being a little bit more technical is oftentimes executives have a unique approach where they see a lot of things that others don't, only because they're exposed to it. So they're talking to different departments. You know, they have an understanding. They're not in a silo trying to work on a specific security control oftentimes. You know, they can span out and understand the bigger picture quite often, and that actually makes a big difference. So I'll give you an example. If I were to go and do geolocation blocking for the state, geolocation blocking is, I don't want any traffic outside the U.S. That's going to help all the different departments in certain ways at my agency. Right? You're going to see less SIM alerts. You're going to see probably a less load on security appliances. You're going to see a less load on servers, load balancers, all of it really. So you can actually focus on doing your job better and have available uptime metrics in a better fashion. So you don't necessarily have to be super technical, but you need to kind of understand the capability piece. But you also have to have the business-centric type mindset. All right, so it doesn't matter if I'm in the public versus private sector. I used to work at Deloitte in consulting, so I'll give you a consulting answer, yes and no. It depends. But the reporting structure at the state is actually really unique. There's a president of NASCIO, who's the National Association for State CIOs. He has a really cool quote. He said, if you've seen one state, you've seen one state, because they're all set up extremely different. So you look at the state of Texas, for example, they have 250 agencies, and all those agencies have their own IT department. You look at the state of Florida, they have 40 agencies, but they're maybe a larger state than Indiana, and Indiana has 100 agencies. So the way we're set up is we have the infrastructure components, so think servers, laptops, desktops, network infrastructure, Active Directories, and shared services like email. Those are the things that we cover, and then agencies themselves, they have the application and data components, right? So maybe a little bit unique there. We also report up to the Office of Management and Budget, and then through the Governor's Office. While in a traditional company, you're going to have like lines of business, and they're going to roll up through a CEO and then to the board, or the C-suite. So kind of similar, but a little different in that respect. The diversity in product set and services, this is kind of an interesting one. So if I'm a bank, or I'm typically going to operate solely in the financial services sector, right? The state has 100 agencies that basically go across every single industry. Super unique. So if I look at finance, for example, I have the Department of Revenue, I have DFI. If I look at utilities, I have OUCC. If I have health, I have the State Department of Health, I have Family and Social Services. If I have transportation, I have NDOT, maybe B&V as well. So basically covering off in one way or another all the different industries. So what that means is a lot more regulation, right? So a bank might have to deal with the Federal Reserve, or maybe if they're collecting credit card payments, PCI type regulators. But the state has pretty much everyone, like I said. And so that becomes really, really challenging to manage across the board because each agency has their own view of what security should look like. And you really have to set global settings on some things. And that kind of creates a challenge where this agency over here might not have any regulators. This one has the most stringent thing. And yes, you can set some things up separately. But when you're doing infrastructure changes, a lot of it's going to be very similar across the board. So much so that actually the organization I mentioned, NASIA, they're actually working with the feds on something to harmonize some of the federal regulations, like the IRS. They have Publication 1075, the FBI has CJIS, FSSA has to meet Center for Medicaid, which is a 1,000-page document that they have to meet all the requirements in. It gets really, really complex. And then the last thing here is, so we're the executive branch, but also we don't really cover the judicial or the legislature. So that's our scope in terms of what we protect. There are also quasi-agencies, though, that don't have to follow all the policies, but consume some of the services. All those quasi-agencies might have their own board. So I've never heard of a company that might have 2 boards or more boards. In this case, still reports to the governor, but they actually have their own board of directors. So it's kind of unique in terms of that public-private sector. All right. So we mentioned we're going to say how to kind of bring up a security program and how to mature it and how to use metrics. So the way I approach it is always with some sort of framework, right? It's really important. If you can, on the last slide we talked about regulators, if you can match up some of the regulation with the frameworks, that's a really good place to start. That's what we did. We also are able to map policies and standards to that. There's other authoritative sources that you can put into a framework, match up those KPIs. Super, super important stuff, especially from the program level, because when you're going to report to a board, you have a consistent framework to actually do that by. And this cybersecurity framework is a really good one for that. It's a little bit longer, and I'm actually not going to show you that one. I'm going to show you a different one that's a little bit easier to implement on the next slide. So after you choose your framework, you're going to want to do some sort of gap analysis. This could be penetration test, maturity assessment, third party coming in to look at all your controls. That's important so that you understand what the priority is of how you might implement some of those controls. Often a misstep, as I said before, is to work with operations. You really need to understand their roadmap to see how you might input something. So maybe an example might be if I were to say, man, our passwords just aren't long enough. You know, I need to move those from 14 characters to 25. Well, that's actually going to cause a significant operational impact if you're still taking manual calls at your help desk, right? If you automate that process, then maybe it's something you could do, right? Password reset. That way you don't have to deal with post-engineering as well. And then once you know the gaps, how that fits in with that strategy, you can start to budget what's necessary and then, of course, execute on the plan. And then how do you do that, right? You need to have really, really good metrics and metrics that matter to the audience. So in my case, OMB and CIO is kind of where I would report some metrics with. We've established a program of 5 metrics that they want to see consistently. And really that actually bubbles up into one metric of how the state is doing in terms of security. One metric. Pretty difficult to do, but that's what they want to see, so that's what we're able to deliver. And then operational teams could be completely different. If you're doing a project on data loss prevention, maybe you want to see specific metrics related to that, but you don't need to look at it all the time. Maybe it's just part of that project. Okay. So, as I want to see critical top 20 before. So this is one of the easier frameworks probably to implement if you're going to start out. The NIST cybersecurity framework is good, but it's a lot longer. So I'll just cover a couple controls. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but it's really interesting. And so in my consulting days, I saw over 10 companies, and it's amazing to me that a hardware and software inventory is so hard to do. I mean, think about it. You have network devices. You have things popping on the network like Internet of Things devices. You have provisioned desktops, but maybe not everything's provisioned. Maybe people can bring their own device. How do you track that? How do you track all the software that gets on those machines? How do you track all the information systems that are out there and all the components? So for me, I definitely want to know information system, what are all the components of it, what data does it hold, what servers does it sit on, where does it sit on the network, what database is it tied to? Super, super challenging stuff. So think about it from your home. Do you track everything in your home? Here are all my assets, I have it in a spreadsheet? Probably not, right? But I bet you have some key things, like maybe you have a really nice watch or something like that. You're probably taking note of that, and you're probably putting it in a safe place. Maybe you're putting in a home safe or something like that. All right, that's really similar to how you might do that in business, but you have to actually document all of those things because people leave. Right? You're not going to leave your own stuff. Email and browser. I saw a stat recently that said 90% of all ransomware comes through a phishing message, which just seems crazy to me. So your email protections are super important. So your security appliances are the last thing that email is going to touch before it hits that end user. So you want to make sure that that those protections are up to snuff and that they're also correlating with web browser. One of the recent things that I've seen is that when people send you a malicious link, sometimes they actually don't send a malicious link first. They actually make the malicious link after you've already received the email. So maybe 2 days later, let's say. There's actually tools out there that can rip that email out of the user's inbox and quarantine it. And those are the type of tools that you really do need as a foundation because that amount of progressiveness in that threat. And then, of course, I think everyone knows about security training and awareness, how important it is. And we've all heard that people can be the weakness, but they can also identify phishing issues. They can also identify process gaps. So they can be an advantage for you as well. So I look at it from that perspective too. All right, so you've established a program, and you've established all these different components with it, but I also like to take a look from the exact opposite perspective. In this case, I'm actually looking at the threats. So we kind of talked about that in building the program. Understand your threats in your vision. Well, this is a key threat that's happening all over the world. Spear phishing and then lateral movement. Anyone know what lateral movement is? The lateral movement is when someone's going to gain access to, let's say, your credentials. So you're not an admin, but someone's logged in on your system as an admin, and I'm able to actually use their hash to actually go across the network and get assets that I want instead of, with somebody else's account. So pretty interesting. I think that's how Sony was taken down, is they had some users that I guess they gave up their credentials in some fashion, and then the person logged into that machine, credentials, and they hopped onto the server, and then they hopped onto a domain controller. So if you don't know what a domain controller is, that's what actually is going to give you access to everything in terms of resources. So if you become a domain admin or an enterprise admin, you own everything, because identity is kind of that new perimeter. So you need to start thinking in terms of threats and say, what controls do I have within those threats? So we kind of talked about email filtering, how that's important. Endpoint protection, same type of thing. We have EDR tools that sit on these laptops. So if you have a malicious action occurring or process strikes that's weird or behavior analysis different, that can actually block that right on the endpoint. Servers as well. You're running something with PowerShell and it doesn't look right, can inspect that and see if it's malicious. Network protection, kind of talked about it a little bit with my home network. but microsegmentation can definitely help you with lateral movement. You can drop packets that are malicious. You obviously have firewalls and things that can limit what gets in and out. And then you have IPS type systems. Vulnerability management, this is really comes in two flavors. It's, hey, what's your cyber hygiene related patches? So I want to make sure that when this is deployed, that it has a good cadence of when those OS patches get on there. Same with servers as well. And then from the other piece of it, it's configuration management is part of vulnerability management. So when you deploy a device, is it fully hardened? When you think about your phone, you can add like an extra password on there, right? That would be considered something like hardening a device. Or even from a privacy perspective, you let every application know your location, access to your camera, contacts, all those things. Those are additional hardening measures that you might do. Penetration testing, talked about it a little bit before, but that third party is important to validate. What if I said, hey, third party, go see if all my controls protect me against lateral movement, see how far you go. Now that's important. So we actually had federal DHS come in and do some of that vulnerability pen test a couple of years ago. Pretty interesting because they started a little bit early without telling you. And they were done in about 60 seconds. So they had loaded some zero-day malware onto a device, never been seen before. So typically, a zero-day is not going to get caught by your EDR tool. But the behavior of the infection was. And so within 60 seconds, that machine was shut down and quarantined on our network, right? And so that comes back to, hey, how can I prove that I'm not subject to this threat, when I consider all these controls? Security awareness training, talked about that one. Internet filtering, kind of talked about that too. Two-factor authentication, that's, a lot of people call that the silver bullet. In many ways it can be if you set it up right. And so from this perspective, if I have higher fidelity assets for lateral movement, maybe I implement two-factor for those different things, right? So they can't move laterally. And then least privilege and asset tiering kind of go a little bit hand in hand. So there's a lot of tools out there that you can use to combat actually what happened to Sony. There's, I think, a free tool for Microsoft called Laps. Anyone heard of that? So when you're in a support organization like ours, we support 35,000 people, right? You're going to have to log on to a laptop or desktop at some point to fix something, install software, what have you. Well, what account are you actually using to log on to that device? That's really important. So Laps is a tool that will actually utilize Active Directory, where I can log into Active Directory, pull that password for that machine, and then I check it back in and it changes. So if I compromise one machine, I don't have an account on there that could be used to move laterally, right? Because that one account for the device and password changes, so it's one and done. Those are the types of controls that you really want to look at. Asset tiering kind of talks about that as well, where you have your expensive watch in the safe, same type of deal, right? Your domain controllers are super, super important. Maybe I'm going to control how those get access, where they get access from, what the device is. Same with servers, and then you have your endpoint protections too. All right. So yeah, it's super important to kind of look at it from both ways. Look at it from the programmatic, hey, here's the framework, but also what are the actual threats that are occurring. And then you want to measure it, right? So we talked a little bit about patch management. Some of the key things I look at, percent of machines patched and servers patched within the latest month to get critical things going on. But what about third-party applications? Java is one of the big ones. How does that integrate with your application? Can you update it? Can be critical. I threw this one in here, policy exceptions, because it can do two things. One, it can see, hey, my organization's trying to take a lot of risks because they're trying to violate policies. Or on the other hand, maybe my standards are terrible. Maybe I've written a standard that needs to change because a lot of people have an exemption against it. And then security awareness training, said it a dozen times. I guess I'll share the success story that we've had. So in 2016, we had 18 to 25% click rate on our fish tests. Really bad. So 10 to 12%, I think, industry average. And what we did is we said, why is that? We're doing an annual training. Annual training often doesn't work because, first of all, we didn't put it in our onboarding, which is a problem. but they just have struggle retaining it. So what we did is we changed up and started doing it monthly, which not a lot of people loved at first, but we also reduced the time. So it's 5 minutes every month, and then every other month it's 15 minutes. So it's like an animation, it just plays, gives you a nice little story, start to remember it. The 15-minute one is a little bit, it has like quizzes and learning. And what we noticed in 2018, we ran another test. We sent out 39,000 emails to state employees with 20 different templates. We use different templates so that you don't notify him, hey, I got this phishing message, don't click. We want to get a real kind of result from it. And we had less than 0.5% click. Less than 0.5% for 39,000 emails. Significant. Now, I'll say that the test was considered complexity-wise on the easier side. And then this first quarter, we ran another test, and it bumped up to 5% with a moderate. So you can raise the complexity on the actual templates that you send out. Super, super important. And really, every metric has that kind of story. And so I've highlighted a few. At one point or another, the states measure all of these. But why would we do that, right? In the case of viruses blocked for email, I definitely want to know if my appliances are doing something. Or maybe I might bring in a new appliance and just compare. Hey, is that going to block what this one does? Same thing on endpoint blocks and malicious actions. We talked about the pen test and how that can definitely save you if something gets in. Number of workstations encrypted. That's kind of a safe harbor thing. You just want to validate that everything going out the door that you're deploying is how you think it is. That's an important one too. Endpoint DLP, USB. So this is one of those settings that we can actually not do globally. So maybe an agency wants no one to have USBs, and they can actually do that with the group policy. But other agencies, maybe they want to have full read and write for all their employees for whatever reason. They can kind of choose those things, but you want to be able to tell who's, it kind of goes to risk posture. What is that agency's risk posture? Email DLP events blocked. Actually ran side-by-side tests with DLP to see how well it worked. And one of the, when we implemented a new DLP tool, I got an email from a person. So they said, hey, you blocked my email, but it doesn't, it's all public information. And I had our Exchange team analyze it. And like on page 15 of the Microsoft Word document, they had missed a digit in their phone number. It was actually a real SSN. So I blocked it. And so I changed it. But that's pretty interesting, right? How good some of the tooling can be. Like if you wrote down 111-11-111, it won't block it. It knows that it's a real SSN. That's how good some of the tools are. Password resets, automated. We also have non-automated there. If you're doing, like I said, if you're doing a project, you want to measure. So we're moving from, hey, call the help desk, reset your password, to a fully automated provisioning service where you can reset it securely. So I want to know how many people are doing that. It's really an operational metric too. But it helps me because I don't have to worry about social engineering if the process is sound, right? Someone's calling in, pretending to be a user, resets the password or something like that. Workstation reimages. I want to know that after all the things you got through, how many are actually causing an issue. It's still found, and we're able to quarantine or reimage quickly, but I still want to know that metric of, hey, what's getting past all our defenses so you can improve. The flip side of the coin, so emails sent with policy instance of PII, that's kind of an interesting one too, because I want to know, are people sending it the right way we intended to? So I block all these things, but how are they actually trying to send it? Hopefully they're not trying to use a Gmail and doing like a little bit of shadow IT. Because we do have specific ways in which you do need to send PII out. It's called a certified mail product. All right, so I'll kind of switch gears and talk about a program that we actually implemented. I was asked to implement something like this. We called it the Executive Branch Security Readiness Program, and it's from the Governor's Office and OMB as kind of a mandate for me to do a risk-based measurement. Those are the kind of the 5 metrics I was talking about earlier. A risk-based measurement of how we're kind of doing. And in order to do that, at first it started off with these 4 metrics. So a maturity assessment. We talked a little bit about that, but I'll go into more detail. So we use the NIST cybersecurity framework, and the The first version of that framework was 5 functions, 22 categories, and 98 subcategories. I think the second version is like 108 subcategories. And they have a maturity model within it, and it's like 3 different tiers. It's really complex, actually. So we changed it, and we follow the CMMI model. And then we established some baseline questions for the scope of users. Those questions are really meant to get everybody answering from or singing from the same sheet of music, right? If I start to ask questions like asset management, for example, I might ask, hey, can you give me an inventory of all your hardware in 48 hours? Okay, no, I can't do that. Okay, rate your current maturity. And then we do a mini risk assessment in there to say, is that acceptable that I can't generate that hardware? If I don't know the hardware, how am I supposed to secure it, right? So it kind of gets it in front of people to understand gaps. And then if it's unacceptable, they have to say, hey, what's my target? And then after these are kind of sequential. So after I do the maturity assessment, I translate that into some sort of security plan. So every agency should have their own security plan because they control the applications, they control the data. So I try to get them to whittle it down to about 10 major gaps, and then they go out for funding for 3 to 5 of those. Because in a lot of security programs, you don't want to kind of eat the elephant. You want to break it up into chunks. We kind of have a saying where we have a lot of planes in the air, and it's really hard to land them as you're launching new planes because they're using resources, right? So you have to actually start to land those planes by taking a smaller chunk and actually getting it done. That's really important. Risk assessment. So we have agencies do kind of participate in our annual pen test. And then that can go back into the security plan too. And then certainly we've talked about some of those training metrics. So what do you think kind of got us over the edge and got us going? Was it the OMB leadership, the executive support? Absolutely. We also kind of tried our hand in gamification, which is interesting. We scoped it for 51 agencies have PII at the state. So for those 51 agencies, we actually started reporting their scores up to OMB and the Gov's office. We didn't necessarily report it to other agencies, right? We didn't want to kind of do that. But just it was enough to say that senior leadership's going to see how we're doing to produce some gamification. We actually had this brought up in some of the governor's cabinet meetings too. So think about that. They're gonna get exposed if they're not doing well in cybersecurity because it is important for the state. So does anyone have like a loyalty program, like anyone at a Marriott or Hilton type person? Okay. They do the same thing, right? I found out I'm 1 year away from a lifetime platinum status. So I'm like, what does that do for me? It gives me maybe some extra points or I get a snack when I show up. But it works because I want to win, right? So next time that I'm in a station, I'm probably going to pick a Marriott because I want to win. So gamification really does work. Or maybe another example is you have a credit card and you go to a gas station. Which credit card are you going to use? Probably the one that gives you the most points if you know what that is. So I'm going to give you 3%. I'm going to charge that card. That's in some way gamification. So how did we do this year? So I'll go back for a second. So how did we do? Well, this year we had 51 out of 51 complete all 3 of these things. Right? The previous years we had like 20. So gamification and the executive support really drives that. And then training metrics, this year we had 94% across the whole state. I think a couple of years ago it was like 40%. Really, really bad. We've only had 3 agencies that are under 90% right now. All right. So I talked about a vision. So you wanna have a vision of where you're gonna end up, right? That's important for that strategy. So you're gonna execute all these tactical things to get to where you really want to go. And that's what this slide's all about. So in 2016, I was asked to move some of the ISO-based policies to NIST and develop this assessment. And around 2017, that's when we started really leveraging our GRC tool. And that was really extremely strategic of what we're trying to do. We had already implemented our security operations within that tool. We had all of our asset management. We talked about inventory. We had all that in there. We imported our information systems inventory that talks about all the confidentiality of a system, the components of what data is collecting, integrity, how important the integrity of that data is, and then set RTOs, RPOs for availability, and then now we've added the GDPR stuff. We had policies and standards in the GRC. We had incident response as well. And so we decided, hey, we have this assessment, why not just put it into the GRC? And like I said, that was strategic because we want people to get in there to do a lot of other security things. So we put that assessment in there, and I went down to RSA Charge, which is a conference for Archer, which is the tool we have. And I showed them what we were doing. They're like, can we steal that? Can we steal what you've done? And they also stole my roadmap, the technical roadmap, and they started presenting it to other customers. So use that as a strategic kind of weapon to get integrated. And then in 2018, that's when we really saw some of the numbers start to increase quite a bit because of that gamification. But really the end goal is I want agencies to really understand and care about security. And so how do you do that? A lot of agencies may say, hey, we don't have the funding to have a person, right? And so we've come up with actually a new program this year. It's called Information Security Officer as a Service. So they may not be able to afford a full one, but what about a part-time one day a week? You can still do a lot of security things and establish that program under that too. And then long-term, it's more about, hey, can OMB actually require every agency that has PI to have somebody on staff or part of this program? And that's kind of the end vision of that rollout. And we also, we're trying to help every state agency. So what we do in this program, we're actually developing a playbook. So think of, it's your first day. I'm going to actually hand you all the integrations you might need to know about for security. Because we're the infrastructure agency, so we provide a lot of things out. And then we'll also provide some RACI charts and things like that to go through who's responsible for what. All right. So you're probably thinking, hey, that's all governance stuff. That's not risk. And you'd be right. Like I said, you have to start somewhere. And so this is actually the 2019. We actually added a new metric. And in number 4, we changed the metric to be not just training completion, but actually how they did on their phishing in each agency. And so it's ultimately I'm accountable for those numbers. So that's why I want to make sure that the training is really well done and the phishing is sufficiently difficult so that we can really get the real risk. And then vulnerability management is obviously risk-based, right? That's saying here's how many vulnerabilities you have in the agency. Now, when I said take small bites, that's what we did here. It's only critical vulnerabilities over 90 days is what we're measuring, right? And that's to say, I only want to see if you've gotten better this year. But next year it'll be like, what's the total amount, and is that acceptable? And you have kind of a frame of each of the colors of scoring. All right. So this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. Maybe not the most academic thing, but to me, I think it works a lot of the time. I use a lot of pictures to help describe something that's occurring in business. So here's an example of, hey, you closed the door, you've locked it, but as you can see, they just left the key under the door, right? There's another good one. I couldn't find it. It's they have a door closed like a hotel room. You know, they have the little bar there, like the deadbolt. Well, they had a Cheeto there, like a actual Cheeto that you would eat. Probably not going to do anything. You think you're secure, but same type of deal here. You left the key under the mat. My favorite one that I couldn't find that I actually used because it's extremely applicable for when people build security in a silo is, so I'll have to describe it to you, I guess. So imagine a field of grass and a road leading up to it, and then you have your badge gates for a car, right? So maybe the badge gates were designed properly, but there's nothing around it. So you just see all these tire marks on each side of the gate. So no one's actually going through it. You're just going completely around it. So think about that in business, right? You might have an application that has all these different things, and maybe this part's secure, but what about all these other things? You don't want to like close your windows and leave the front door open, right? It's more common than you think. And so I try to use and go to the human element as well. We talked about, I specifically did this, but we talked about home and car as part of this because pretty much everyone in here probably has one of those things or in some fashion, right? So that's a good way to relate to your audience is to speak about things that they know about or that they have. That's actually a good way I describe some of the risk management processes. You know, if I was driving down here, let's say today, and it was snowing, I might talk about, hey, here's context establishment for that risk process. So maybe I need to make sure that my tires are full. Maybe I need to use four-wheel drive. So you're talking about control in a process. So that's a really good way to also connect to that human element. All right, so let's see if this works. So the CTO and I, we often talk about, I want to have people maybe not do shadow IT, right? So I want people to do maybe riskier things in my house so that they don't do it somewhere else. So he talks about, hey, if I had a daughter and she was underage, I want her to drink in my house versus somebody else's. Kind of true in the business world as well. Because at the end of the day, if the end user doesn't like how security is, they might just completely do something else, like drop files in a Google Drive or use Dropbox. So let's see if this can work. This is a really cool example. See that? Yep. All right, so this is the user with no limits. Now you're going to add some policy to it. Password policy, simple stuff. Struggling to get through it. Access control. DLP, the data loss prevention tooling. Really struggling, right? Oh, now it's really hard. I've added all these standards up, and then I've jumped. So that's really a good example, right? So I try and utilize these things at work because it paints a really good story, and it helps people understand it really well. That's probably my favorite one right now. All right. So don't underestimate the user experience in operations as part of that CISO role. It's super, super important for that reason exactly. Right? You don't want people, you don't have so much security that you create a user experience where they can't even work. That makes no sense, right? Because they're just going to do that. They're going to jump right over all the standards and do anything they can to get out of those controls. So think about, like, on your phone, Face ID, right? That accomplishes user experience and security. I mean, you probably debate that, say, some people don't like Face ID or think it's secure. But at some point, you have to do business. And so how are you going to do that? What controls are you going to set? All right, final thoughts here. To me, we're all risk officers at the end of the day. Whether it's business or personal, you really need to think about risk almost in everything that you do. So if I'm spinning up a new project, what's architecture risk? What's project risk itself? Maybe I'm acquiring new technology. Maybe I have a vendor that is going to house a lot of PII data. So maybe I should look at the financial risk of that company. Operational risk, are they hosting a very critical thing for me? And I can couple that with financial and say, they've only been around for 2 years and they have no assets. And maybe that's a problem if I'm creating a critical service for that. Reputational risk, so all of that's important. The second piece, so I actually saw this, a former professor here, Tony Girth, he posted on LinkedIn, and I think it was from another CIO, so I'm not actually sure who said it. But he said, change at a speed appropriate for the org. And I thought that's super, super important because culture is key. You can either change the culture or you have to fit in with the culture, right? And most people aren't doing culture change. And so culture is what's going to last, right? So you kind of need to make sure that you're aligned to it in some of the things that you're doing. Now, sometimes you still want to move fast, even in a culture that's not as fast. And there's definitely strategies to tactfully do that. Some of the things that I've done, for example, are I've hosted office hours for, let's say, the GRC or new products that we're putting out, new processes. I produced a lot of one-pagers, formal training, roadmaps, communications, all those things for people to consume in kind of those bite-sized chunks. And then I had to throw in kind of a golf reference here because I'm a golfer, but play the long game while improving your short game. So you saw the roadmap slide with the little streak. Same thing here. That's the long game, but you have to do a lot of things that are short term in order to get to where you want to be. So I hope this was maybe a little bit of a paradigm shift from what you maybe normally hear, maybe not as academic, but hopefully you could take something that benefits you. So thanks for listening, and thanks for having me.
Brian, thanks a lot.
Not our first supply talk, but it's well taken. So yeah, we have about 5 minutes or so. Are there any questions for Brian? Yeah, please get it started.
Do you report to the CIO, or does the state have a CIO? And also, does that CIO talked about the executive branch and judicial, and another one? Is the CIO on all three branches?
Yep.
There's any breaking news there, right? Because Dewan's
Dewan's actually just taken another role. His last day is on the 22nd. He's the CIO. But the CIO for the state is over all the infrastructure. I believe technically the other CIOs, every agency has an IT director or a CIO. And technically I think they have to report something up to Dewan in that role, but they're separate. So the CIO is the state CIO, CIO of my agency.
Somewhat centralized. Yeah.
It's centralized on the infrastructure.
Is that individual, is he on the governor's cabinet?
Yes, he was. I don't know if that role still is, but previously, yes, he's on the governor's cabinet.
Report to that person?
So he reports to actually someone in OMB. So who actually came from the Gov's office. Maybe that's why they might have changed some things. But yeah, so he reports up to OMB, and OMB reports up to the Gov's office.
Do you report to the CIO?
I report to the CIO. Yeah. Now, that's a good question, though, because I've seen a lot of different organizations change that. So actually, one of the local ones in Indianapolis, the CISO reports to the CFO, and the CIO reports to the CEO. So that's kind of an interesting model. So I think you're going to see a lot of that, and maybe even you might see that people have a chief risk officer, and maybe that is reported to elsewhere too. So maybe a CIO or a CISO might report in there, or maybe the CISO becomes chief risk officer.
In higher education, I would say a CIO has academic background always is probably much more successful. Or what in the state government, what kind of background that individual would really, you think, make them successful?
I've found value of all the consulting that I've done, personally, just because I've seen so many things and I've seen what works. And it's extremely complex, and oftentimes people bring in consultants for complex problems. And so when you start to see that, to me, that's a really good use case. And that's, in fact, our agency was, when it was started, a lot of people were actually from consulting.
Do you need any political type of background at all? Understand the political stuff?
Other than corporate politics, which is there everywhere, no. I still don't know a lot about politics because I don't really care to. It doesn't impact me on doing my job. It might on the CIO a little bit, but from my perspective, no. But yeah, I mean, it's an appointed position, so it could be political in that way. So for example, in other states, there was, I think, 20 new CIOs this year out of the 50 states because there was 20 new governors. So you do have some of that. I'm a little bit protected at a lower level, so they're probably not, hopefully not going to go after me. It's a very Republican state, so I think he'll get reelected.
So how is the state sort of split up the C-suite function? So what, for example, how the CIO's political appointments, how do they relate to the CISOs or CSOs or CTO? How do they split those roles and functions?
So our organization actually has all those. We have a CIO, we have a CAO, which is administrative, we have a chief technology officer, we have me, and then we have a chief operating officer, and we have a chief financial officer. And then other agencies, even if they're smaller, typically have, like I said, an IT director, but they don't often have those other C-level positions. It will report up to an agency head, particularly.
So does the CTO then sort of always in charge of technology development strategy, and then CIO IT, and then CISO usually reports to CIO?
Yes. Yep. So I work really close with the CTO on everything that they're trying to get done as well. So you want to come out with something new that enhances user experience, how can we secure that appropriately and design architecture in the right way? So yeah.
Interesting to compare and contrast the statement I use, organizational structure. It looks like we're at the top of the hour, so if there's some remaining questions, maybe we could have one or two come up, and feel free, Brian can. Oh, is there someone on the, I'm so sorry. They might just be stretching. Can you guys hear us? Did you have a question, virtually?
Indy did not have a question, though. Thank you.
Oh, no worries at all. Might have just been a good stretch there. But hey, thanks so much again for coming out. Hey, happy holidays. All right. And remember, January 30th, we'll see you for
Thank you for coming.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Brian. Really appreciate it. Yeah, no problem.